Okay, hello everybody, and thanks for joining watching this presentation entitled "Facilitating Elementary Level Spanish Students' Grammatical Competence Through Children's Literature." My name is Brian Hibbs. I'm an associate professor of education / ESOL at Dalton State College in the United States, and I'm very happy to be a part of this conference and to be giving you this presentation. So when we think about the concept of grammatical competence, there are a number of definitions that exist out there. One definition that I personally find useful are the researchers Canali and Swain, where they talk about communicative competence, and they identify four subcompetencies, of which grammatical competence is one. So they define grammatical competence as the knowledge of lexical items and of rules of morphology, syntax, semantics, and phonology. But they also explain that grammatical competence also involves the knowledge of how to determine and express accurately the literal meaning of utterances. So the idea is that grammatical competence not only involves the knowledge of the particular grammatical or linguistic structures of a given language and how the language works, but also how one might use possibly use that knowledge when using it for communicative purposes in the outside world. And so these definitions were used to frame the current study. When we think about teaching grammar, there are several approaches, two popular overarching approaches that are often used in grammar teaching: a deductive and an inductive approach. And so these you potentially may be familiar with. So a deductive approach to teaching grammar typically initially exposes students to where the teacher explicitly gives explicit instruction on a specific grammatical or linguistic feature of the target language, and then students subsequently practice mastering the range of that grammatical feature. Conversely, an inductive approach starts with some kind of quote unquote text or language sample, and that could be written, it could be oral or video or some other format, but some kind of language sample in which a particular linguistic or grammatical feature is embedded in the text, and that students are initially exposed to that language sample and then form hypotheses about not only the grammar point and how it works, but also the form-function relationship in that grammatical feature, meaning how is that grammatical feature used to accomplish communicative goals in the target language. And so with respect to this, the study explored in this presentation, both approaches were utilized in different steps in the process. Particularly a framework that was used in the second phase of the study, the inductive part, that parts of this model were used, that's called the PACE model. So PACE is an acronym that stands for Presentation, Attention, Co-construction, and Extension. And this is a model that can be used to teach grammar inductively. So the first stage is presentation, where students are initially exposed to some language sample, and that sample contains a particular grammatical or linguistic feature that the teacher wishes to practice. The second stage, after initially exposing students to the text and verifying their comprehension of the text, students' attention is drawn to the particular linguistic or grammatical feature in the text, but the teacher doesn't make any comments about it, simply drawing their attention to that feature. In the third stage, co-construction, so this is a discussion that is guided by the teacher in which students explore the grammatical point, the grammatical feature, hypothesize about how they think it's working within the text, but also think about how that feature is utilized to convey or convey meaning in the target language. And then step 4, extension. So students have opportunities to practice that grammatical feature in communicative ways to reinforce that form-function relationship. And so the PACE model was used as a framework to design the activities in the second phase of the study. So the research question that framed the study was what are elementary level Spanish students' perceptions regarding the relevancy of children's literature in Spanish to their developing grammatical competence in Spanish? So particularly looking at the second phase of the study, where children's literature, a specific children's book was utilized to deepen students' developing knowledge of a particular feature of Spanish, and so gathering feedback and documenting and gathering feedback regarding students' perspectives regarding the strengths and weaknesses of the course unit. To give you a bit of context for the study, so the study took place at a 4-year public college post-secondary institution in the southeastern United States. This took place in a elementary Spanish 2 course, Spanish 1002. So this is a course that most of the students in the course were monolingual English speakers that were learning Spanish as a foreign language. Although there were also in both classes, there were 2 sections and 30 students in total that were involved in the study. But several of the students in each class were what you might be categorized as heritage students or heritage speakers. These were students that had previously had some initial exposure, like conversational abilities in the language. This study took place in the fall semester of 2016. The particular feature that was highlighted were 2 past verb tenses that are often used in Spanish, the preterite versus the imperfect. And the children's book that was used in the second phase of the study was El Cuento de Ferdinando, or the story of Ferdinand. So this was a book that talks about Ferdinand, who is written by Monroe Leaf, where the Ferdinand is a bull that does not typify the often associated characteristics with bulls, and so in his adventures throughout the book. So students read the Spanish translation of Monroe Leaf's book, and this book was chosen particularly because the story, it was felt that the story was relatively easy to understand, but also where the book also exemplified the preterite and the imperfect were utilized abundantly in the book, and so that it contained numerous examples of each of these verb tenses that students could study and be exposed to. The study took place in 3 phases as part of the course. So the first phase was utilizing the deductive approach, where students received explicit instruction regarding the preterite and imperfect tenses, and they did some subsequent practice of attempting to at least start to master those verb tenses. The second phase was more inductive, so where it was utilized parts of the PACE model, and then using the Cuento de Ferdinando book that were to contextualize and the verb tenses in Spanish, but also to reinforce the instructions they'd received in phase 1. And then the third phase, students completed a post-course questionnaire, which consisted of open-ended questions where students documented their feedback on what they felt were the strengths and weaknesses on the course unit. So this kind of gives an example of some of the one activity that was done in the second phase, where students read, in the first part, students read the book and we read it and discussed it together as a class. And the students were subsequently grouped into different groups, and they completed worksheets where they documented, for example, in the left-hand column, verbo, which is verb. So these are examples of verbs contained within the book that were either in the preterite and imperfect. So students had about 20 worksheet that contained 20 or so verbs in the book that were either the preterite and the imperfect, and then as a group they had determined for each verb whether they felt it was the preterite or in the preterite or imperfect tense, what infinitive that verb came from, what the subject of the sentence was, and then what category that infinitive fit under. So if it was AR, ER, IR verb, was it a regular verb or an irregular verb? So some preliminary findings were that students identified a number of strengths in the course unit. One of them was, as was kind of intended, was that the book helped them see how the verb tenses were actually used that actually deepened their understanding of the form-function relationship between both verb tenses. So one student commented that the phase 2 activities were more fun than just reading sentences using the verb tenses, and that the activity was helpful because the student was able to see the sentences in the story coming together. Another student commented that overall, I believe the activity worked fine between going over the differences between the two forms and when to use them, and then reading the book to see what we learned in action. So a number of students commented that reading the book reinforced their understanding of the form-function relationship between each of the verb tenses and actually see how they were being used. A number of students commented on several weaknesses that they found in the course unit. Typically, a number of students commented that the lexical complexity of the book impeded their understanding of both verb tenses. So one student commented that one student had to look at many of the verb's meanings. I could see how the verb was conjugated and knew which group it belonged to, but not always what it was saying. So another student said more or less the same thing, that at times it was hard to understand the story. This would cause confusion at times when trying to focus on learning the verb tenses. And so this is a consideration to keep in mind if you're using either children's literature or some other teaching grammar inductively and you're using some kind of text, to think about the lexical complexity and to make sure that the book that you're using is largely within the current proficiency levels of your students. And then finally, students had a number of suggestions for improving the course unit moving forward. So one student commented that perhaps expanding the activity in the second phase with a second book so the students can draw comparisons across the story's grammar. So continuing the activities that we were doing, but using them with other books. And then another student commented that I think it would be good to have both the English and Spanish versions of each book in order to gain a better understanding of how Spanish reads. So again, using the English translation perhaps first would have helped them better understand the story and would have reduced the lexical processing load for students to understand the Spanish version. So next steps that I have planned for this study, I plan to replicate this study possibly in a number of different ways. So perhaps replicating the study at the same as Spanish 1002 level, perhaps concentrating on both the preterite and imperfect tenses, but maybe as one of the students commented on, using different children's books to see if, to extend their learning. Another possibility that I plan to do is perhaps using either different verbs at the same course level, but concentrating on different verb tenses or different grammatical or linguistic features that are typical at the 1002 level. Another possibility might be to use perhaps the same verb tenses, but maybe at a different proficiency level, say at the third or fourth semester level, or even beyond that. And also kind of using either the same or different sort of verb tenses to see if the results obtained here would also hold across either different grammatical features, but also different proficiency levels. And then finally, the second phase, so the questionnaire was largely qualitative. So in subsequent iterations of the study, I would like to employ a mixed methods methodology to include some Likert scale items to do more of a descriptive statistics to identify overall trends regarding students' comments on the strengths and weaknesses of the course unit. So these are the references for the presentation. So thank you very much for watching this presentation. Here's my contact information. So if you would like a copy of these slides, or if you would like to contact me about more information regarding the study, this is my contact information. So thank you very much.